Whispers in the Walls. Part 1. The Uninvited Guest. It was the kind of house that no one spoke about. Tucked away at the end of an overgrown road, half hidden by the thick, twisting branches of ancient trees, the old mansion at the edge of the town was a relic from another time. Its windows were long since shattered, its wood peeling from neglect, and its once grand stone facade was now covered in ivy, like a wounded, forgotten giant trying to bury itself in the earth. The townfolk had whispered about the house for years. They spoke of strange lights that flickered in the windows at night, shadows that moved behind the curtains when there was no one inside, and the occasional echo of a child's laughter carried by the wind. No one had lived there for decades, but it was as if something still inhabited the space, something far darker than mere bricks and mortar. The house had become an object of morbid curiosity for many, but the truth was that no one had dared approach it in years. No one except for one person, Max Harland. Max was a writer, a man whose mind had been consumed by the eerie, the unexplained, and the forgotten corners of the world. His work was primarily focused on the paranormal, the occult, and the forgotten histories of old towns and places. And it was this obsession that had led him to the house. Max had heard the rumors of the abandoned mansion for years, but the stories never seemed to match. The more he dug, the more the house intrigued him, until one fateful evening, he decided to see it for himself. His old car crept slowly along the overgrown road. The engine sputtered as he passed abandoned farmhouses and rusted-out vehicles. His headlights bounced off the dark, twisted trunks of trees, casting long, stretching shadows across the crumbling path. As he neared the house, the weight of it seemed to press down on him, as though the very earth was reluctant to give way to the looming structure ahead. The house was as imposing as the rumors had suggested. Its Gothic silhouette towered against the fading light of day, the windows like dark eyes staring into the abyss. The iron gates at the front were twisted and broken, hanging by a few rusted bolts, and the gravel driveway was half covered in weeds. Max parked his car a few yards from the entrance and got out. The air smelled of decay and forgotten things, a scent that clung to his clothes as he stepped toward the porch. He had brought his camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, his tools for this new chapter of research. He was going to explore this place, to capture the truths behind the whispers. And if there was a story hidden in its walls, Max was determined to uncover it. As he approached the door, the wind picked up, howling through the empty trees. Max paused, glancing back at his car. It seemed so far away, parked alone in the eerie twilight, but it was too late to turn back now. He had crossed the threshold, both metaphorically and physically, into a world he could not escape. He tried the door. It creaked and groaned as he pushed it open. The sound echoed in the empty air, unnaturally loud, as if the house itself was waiting for him to enter. Max hesitated, the darkness inside beckoning him like a shiver crawling up his spine. The first step inside the mansion was like crossing into another realm. The air was heavy, stagnant. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, and the floorboards beneath his feet groaned in protest. Max flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom and illuminating the hallway before him. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces obscured by layers of grime and decay, but their eyes, those eyes, seemed to follow him. He shuddered, adjusting his grip on the flashlight as he moved further inside. His boots echoed loudly as he walked deeper into the house, the silence pressing in around him like a suffocating fog. The mansion seemed to stretch endlessly, with long, narrow corridors leading to closed doors and forgotten rooms. The wallpaper, once grand, was now peeling away in strips, and the air carried the faint scent of mildew, rot, and something more disturbing, something alive. As he walked down the hallway, he felt an odd sensation, like he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He stopped, briefly glancing over his shoulder. The hallway was empty, the faint light of the flashlight bouncing off the walls, but the sense of presence lingered. Something was in the house with him. He continued, determined to find the source of the stories he had heard for so long. The first room he entered was the living room. It was a large space with high ceilings, a grand fireplace at one end, and rows of old furniture covered in thick sheets of dust. The furniture looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. In the corner of the room, a tall, ancient mirror leaned against the wall, its surface cracked and foggy. As Max's flashlight swept over the room, the reflection in the mirror caught his eye. For a moment, the image he saw seemed distorted. The room behind him appeared wrong. There was a shape in the reflection, something moving in the shadows, standing just behind him. Max whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room. His pulse thudded in his ears, the hairs on his neck prickling with fear. He stepped closer to the mirror, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. In the reflection, he saw it again, something standing in the corner. A figure. He blinked, but the figure was still there, motionless, just behind him. Max froze, the blood draining from his face as the temperature in the room dropped. The air grew cold, and he could see his breath fogging in front of him. The figure in the mirror moved. Slowly, it stepped forward, its form becoming clearer. A woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at him. Her mouth stretched into a wide, unsettling grin. Max's breath caught in his throat. Without thinking, he spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. The mirror reflected only the darkness, the flickering light from his flashlight casting strange, angular shadows across the room. Max took a step back, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? His hands were shaking as he turned toward the door. Maybe it was time to leave. Maybe he wasn't supposed to be here. But before he could make a move, the house shifted. A loud crack echoed from the walls, then another, followed by a rumbling like distant thunder. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, and the lights flickered out. Max was plunged into darkness. The air grew thick. It felt as though the house itself was alive, constricting around him, pulling him into its depths. The whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "You should not have come." Max's pulse raced as he turned, but there was nowhere to run. The walls seemed to close in on him, the whispers rising to a maddening crescendo. He felt his feet slip beneath him as something cold and slick spread across the floor. A shape emerged from the darkness, its form tall and looming. Max could barely make out its features, but he felt its presence, its cold, malevolent energy. The figure in the mirror was standing before him now. "You will stay with us." Max reached for his flashlight, but it slipped from his hand, the beam flickering one last time before going dark. And then, the whispers stopped. The house was silent, and Max was no longer alone. Part 2. The Unseen Presence. Max's eyes snapped open, his breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. His heart hammered in his chest, his hands slick with sweat. He was lying on the floor of the living room, the old wooden floorboards cold against his skin. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy, as though it were pressing down on him from all sides. He scrambled to his feet, his body trembling with fear and confusion. The flashlight, which had been in his hand only moments before, now lay a few feet away, its lens cracked, casting an erratic flicker of light across the room. Max's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. The door had slammed shut, trapping him inside. The temperature had plummeted, and then the whispers, that awful, insistent murmuring, and then the figure in the mirror. The figure that now felt too real, too vivid in his memory. He glanced around the room. The furniture was still covered in thick layers of dust, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Nothing had changed. Nothing except for the presence. Something was different. It was as if the house had shifted, had woken, just like the stories said. Max swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to breathe. The whispering started again, faint at first, like a distant hum in his ears. It was hard to tell if it was real or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He grabbed the flashlight and turned it back on, but the light was dim, flickering erratically. His hand shook as he swung the beam across the room, the shadows moving unnaturally in its light. A sudden movement caught his eye. There, at the far corner of the room, the tall mirror, still cracked, still discolored, shifted slightly, as if something was standing in front of it. Max's heart lurched in his chest. He hadn't seen it move before. Had he? He hesitated, staring at the reflection in the mirror, praying to see nothing but his own wide-eyed face staring back at him. But he didn't. The reflection was different this time. A dark figure stood, impossibly tall, with hollow eyes that burned with a cold, unfeeling light. Its features were indistinct, blurred, but the malicious presence was unmistakable. It was there, in the mirror, right behind him. Max's breath caught. He slowly turned around, his neck stiff, his body frozen in place. But there was no one there. Nothing. Just the empty room. Yet in the mirror, the figure remained. "Stay with me." The voice was in his mind now, not just a whisper. It was an overwhelming presence, like a weight pressing against his skull, suffocating him. The sound of his pulse in his ears grew louder, drowning out all other noise. He felt the walls closing in. He reached out a hand shakily toward the mirror, almost hypnotized by the figure in its depths. His fingers grazed the surface of the glass. Nothing happened at first. And then, the mirror rippled. A cold, wet sensation crawled up his arm, and the next thing he knew, his hand was being pulled forward by an unseen force. Max gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts as the air around him grew heavier still. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, the frost forming at the edges of the room as if winter had crept into the house uninvited. He stumbled back, trying to pull away from the mirror, but the sensation of being dragged deeper into it intensified. The voice, the whispers, filled his mind, louder now, clearer. "It's too late for you, Max. You've already come too far." Max's pulse thundered in his ears. He tore his hand away with a violent jerk, the mirror shaking in its frame, but as he pulled back, he felt something new, a deep, bitter coldness clinging to him, like fingers wrapped around his ribs, squeezing tightly. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled again, and Max found himself falling forward, into the darkness. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as the world around him seemed to stretch, twist, and fold in on itself. Max wasn't sure how long he was lost in that void. The darkness was thick, suffocating, but there was a rhythm to it, an odd pulsing, like the beating of a heart. He felt as though the walls were closing in on him, the air growing heavier, thick with the weight of something unseen. Then, a flash of light. It was brief, so brief, Max wasn't sure if it was real, but it illuminated something in the distance. A hallway, dimly lit, stretching on into the blackness, with doors on either side. He staggered forward, drawn by the dim light that beckoned him, but the closer he got, the more the darkness seemed to pull him away. He had to fight it. He had to move. Max's legs shook with effort, but he pushed forward, forcing his feet to carry him down the hallway, toward the light. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted and writhed like something alive, as if the house itself were reaching out to grab him. He reached the first door and tried the handle. It turned easily, the wood creaking as it swung open. Inside, the room was barely illuminated by the faint, sickly light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. The floor was covered in dust and old, decaying furniture. But the thing that caught his attention immediately was the old wooden chair sitting at the center of the room. It wasn't like the rest of the room. It was clean, pristine even, as though it had been cared for. There were no signs of dust, no decay. The chair was well maintained, the wood polished, the leather seats smooth and undisturbed. Max stepped inside, his heart racing. The whispers seemed louder here, clearer. "Come closer, Max. The chair awaits you." He couldn't resist. He was drawn to it, his body moving on its own. He felt the icy fingers of fear gripping his throat, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He was too far gone now. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the back of the chair. The moment his fingers made contact, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the faint light. Max froze, the darkness swallowing him once more. And then a voice. "Sit." He obeyed before he even realized it. The chair seemed to mold to his form as he sat, his muscles stiff and unwilling to move. It felt as though the chair were holding him in place, as though he were bound by invisible threads. And then, the presence. It flooded the room like an ocean, a dark, oppressive weight, suffocating, swallowing him whole. "You are mine now, Max Harland. This place, this house, will never let you leave." Max's eyes snapped open. He was back in the living room. The house had returned to its former state, the broken windows, the dust, the stillness. But everything was different. The walls felt closer. The air was heavier. The house had changed him. A figure appeared in the doorway. A woman. Pale. Her eyes hollow, lifeless, but her mouth stretched into a wide, twisted grin. Max recognized her face. The woman in the mirror. And then she spoke. "Welcome home." Part 3, The Unraveling. Max's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as he stared at the woman standing in the doorway. The room had changed, but it wasn't just the house, it was him. The oppressive air felt like it was pulling at him, as though the walls were pressing in on him, whispering his name over and over, urging him to stay. His pulse raced in his ears, a loud, steady drumbeat that drowned out everything else, but her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, held him frozen in place. Her smile, wide and unsettling, didn't reach her eyes, which were as empty as the abyss. The woman took a slow step forward, her feet barely making a sound against the floor. "You're not going anywhere, Max," she said, her voice cold, smooth, as if each word was laced with venom. "You never were." Max's hands trembled at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to flee, but he couldn't move. He couldn't move. The chair, no, the presence, had woven itself into him, its unseen threads curling tighter and tighter, binding him to this place. "Who are you?" Max managed to choke out, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. His heart hammered in his chest as he took in the figure before him. She was dressed in a long, black gown that flowed unnaturally as she moved, her skin pale, almost translucent. There was something wrong about her, something ancient, something that didn't belong here. "You already know who I am," she replied, her voice sending chills down his spine. "I am the one who has waited for you. For so long. I've watched you." Max watched your obsession with this house. "You thought you could unravel its mysteries. But you were just another piece in the puzzle. Another soul to join the collection." Max's mind reeled. His pulse raced with fear and confusion. The memories of what had happened earlier, the whispers, the mirror, the chair, it all flooded back in an overwhelming rush. The presence that had claimed him, the coldness, the strange, otherworldly force that had taken him. I don't understand, Max gasped, trying to push himself out of the chair. But the moment his feet touched the floor, it felt as though the room itself held him back, like invisible chains wrapped around his legs. What do you want from me? The woman's smile widened, but it was a smile that had nothing to do with warmth or kindness. It was a smile that was hungry, greedy. I want you to remember, she said softly. I want you to remember everything. With that, she stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Max's throat tightened. He could feel the air in the room growing colder, suffocating him, pressing in on his chest. The house seemed to breathe with him, each exhale of air feeling like a threat, a reminder of how powerless he was. She stopped just in front of him, her face now only inches away. Her breath was icy against his skin. Max could see her eyes now, the empty, dark pits that stared into his soul, void of compassion or mercy. Do you see it now? She whispered. The truth of this place? The truth of your family? Max's stomach churned. His family? He didn't understand. What did his family have to do with any of this? Before he could voice his confusion, the room around him seemed to shift. The walls groaned as though alive, the sound echoing with the weight of centuries. The air grew thick and suffocating, and suddenly, memories that weren't his own began to flood his mind, visions of a past that felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone close to him. He saw a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadows. A woman, her dark eyes filled with sorrow. A child, standing in a room, its walls covered in strange symbols. The images shifted rapidly, too fast for him to understand, but each one felt like it tore through his mind, unraveling him from the inside out. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a name came to him. Maximilian Harland. It was his own name, but it wasn't. It was someone else's. A different version of himself. A version from a past that he had forgotten. The woman standing in front of him was no longer a stranger. She was his mother. The memories shattered and reformed, disjointed and broken, like fragments of a dream that refused to let him wake. You are a part of this, she whispered, her voice now heavy with the weight of time. You are the last one, the last of the Harland bloodline. Max's eyes widened in horror. No, that can't be. My family's dead. I was just a writer, an investigator. The woman tilted her head, her smile twisting. Oh, Max, you've always been more than you think. You were chosen. You were always meant to be here. The room began to blur around him, and he stumbled backward, falling to the floor. He could hear the whispers now, louder, coming from all directions, from within the walls themselves. The house was alive with voices, the voices of the dead, of the ones who had come before him, trapped here for eternity. You're not just a visitor, the woman continued, her form growing more distorted, like a mirage in the dark. You're a vessel. You've come to complete the cycle. You will finish what was started. Max felt the weight of her words settle deep within him. A cold dread crawled up his spine. What was she talking about? What cycle? And why him? Before he could question further, the darkness in the room began to pulse, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The air turned cold enough to freeze his breath. The floor beneath him vibrated as if the house itself was coming to life. His vision blurred, and his pulse thundered in his ears. Then he felt it. A presence. A shadow. Max turned his head toward the door, but no one was there. Yet the sense of being watched intensified, overwhelming him. The whispers from the walls grew louder, more insistent, crawling beneath his his skin. "You are ours, Max." The voice was no longer the woman's. It was everywhere. 1,000 voices merged into one, speaking through the house itself. "You have always been ours." Max's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to move, to stand, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. Something was holding him in place. His mind screamed to break free, but he couldn't. The weight of the house of the curse pressed down on him. The woman stepped forward, her form now fully distorted, like a creature out of a nightmare. She reached out to him, her fingers long and clawed, and as she touched his face, the last remnants of his consciousness slipped away. Max awoke. But it wasn't the living room anymore. The house was different. It was no longer a decaying ruin. It was pristine, grand, alive. The air was thick with incense, and the faint hum of strange chanting. The floor was smooth marble, the walls adorned with gold and velvet. It was as though he had been transported to another time, another place, somewhere far more ancient, far more sinister. A voice echoed from behind him. "You've been asleep for too long." Max turned. And before him stood the shadowed figure, the one who had haunted his mind, the one he had become. Part 4. The Gathering Shadows. Max stood in silence, barefoot on the polished black marble floor of a house that no longer resembled the ruin he had entered. Gone were the splintered floorboards, the choking dust, the scent of decay. The walls were immaculate and towering, covered in deep red wallpaper laced with golden runes that shifted subtly when looked at too long. Elegant chandeliers flickered with candlelight, casting long, twitching shadows that danced like puppets around him. He had no memory of walking here. No memory of waking. Only the voice that had echoed through him before he'd opened his eyes. "You've been asleep for too long." And the figure now standing before him. It looked like him, but older. Hollowed. With skin stretched too tight over its face, and eyes like polished glass, reflecting everything, feeling nothing. Max's breath caught as he studied the figure, his knees locking with dread. "What are you?" Max whispered. The other smiled, a dry, unnatural curl of the lips. "What you were always meant to be." Max backed away, his bare feet slipping slightly on the gleaming floor. No, I'm not like this. I came here to write, to investigate. To remember," the doppelganger interrupted. "To wake. You were drawn here because a part of you never left. This house was your cradle, and it will be your tomb. Like all the Harlands before you." The words struck something deep inside. Harland. His family name. He had heard it in the woman's voice, in the cursed mirror's whisper, and in the dreamlike memories flashing through his mind. But he still couldn't make sense of it, how he could be a part of this place. "I don't remember," Max said, shaking his head. "I don't remember anything like this." "You were taken before you could," said the figure. "You were hidden. They tried to protect you. But blood always calls back home." Suddenly, the walls began to throb, as if alive, pulsing with a heartbeat that grew louder, deeper, until the vibrations buzzed in Max's teeth. A sound, somewhere between a breath and a moan, filled the halls, a low, drawn-out sigh that echoed from the house itself. It was awake. The chandelier's candles dimmed. The shadows deepened. And from the far end of the hall, figures emerged. Dozens of them. Pale, translucent forms, men, women, children, all dressed in the garb of 100 different eras, all with blank expressions, hollow eyes. They filled the space silently, forming a circle around Max and his reflection. They were not alive. Nor were they simply dead. They were bound. Max's mouth went dry. "Who are they?" he asked, barely managing the words. "Your blood," the reflection answered. Every Harland that came before you, bound to the house, feeding it, guarding the truth buried beneath its bones. And soon, the reflection stepped closer, its face now impossibly close, voice curling like smoke into Max's ear. So will you. The figures around him began to whisper. Max clutched his ears, but the voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside his skull, scraping against the walls of his mind. The same words over and over. Finish the cycle. Seal the blood. Return to the walls. No! Max shouted. I'm not part of this. I won't be. The crowd parted. And from the darkness beyond, she returned. The woman from the mirror. From the chair. From the dream that might not have been a dream. Max's mother. Only now, she looked as she had in the vision, whole, elegant, yet utterly unnatural. Her skin too smooth, her smile too wide, her dress dragging behind her like a black veil dipped in oil. The others bowed their heads as she passed. Only Max stared, shaking. You were born in this house, she said softly. The last heir to its gift. They tried to hide you from it, but you came back. Because the house calls. And you heard it, even if you didn't understand. I was just curious, Max muttered. Just chasing a story? No, she said, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. You were answering. You came home. And now you must take your place. The doppelganger stepped aside. A door behind it slowly creaked open, on its own. Inside was a small, circular room lined with dozens of mirrors. In each, Max saw himself. But not reflections, versions. Some screaming, some crying, some grinning with madness. Each man showed a path he could have taken, or already had. And in the center of the room sat a black wooden chair. The same one he had seen in the other vision. But this time, it wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped in the chair, bound in chains, head bowed. Blood had pooled at its feet and dried into dark stains. Its skin was pale, its lips stitched shut, and its body barely rose with each breath. Max stepped forward, heart hammering. The figure raised its head. It was him, but older. Hollowed. Broken. The reflection. The future. Your soul has always been divided, his mother said behind him. Now you must choose. The house cannot survive unless someone remains. Someone to hold it together. That's how we've endured. Each generation gives one to keep the house alive. I won't do it, Max said, trembling. I won't become that thing. I won't stay here. You already have. The reflection whispered. You just haven't accepted it yet. The air grew colder. The whispers louder. Suddenly, Max felt pain bloom in his chest, sharp and agonizing. He looked down. Blood. His blood. Pouring from a wound that hadn't been there a moment ago. He fell to his knees. The crowd closed in. But not with violence. They began chanting. Low. Rhythmic. Steady. And the house breathed again. Walls shifted. The mirrors in the chamber cracked. The floor rippled. From above, dust and bits of plaster fell like ash. The house was reshaping. Rebuilding, reacting to his decision, or the lack of one. Max crawled toward the chair, every fiber of his being screaming in rebellion. But some darker part of him knew. There was no choice. This was the cost of the Harland bloodline. Of remembering. Of waking up. His hand gripped the chair. Cold, familiar wood. It hummed beneath his touch. He turned his head toward the door, toward the faintest light of a world beyond. But it was already gone. All that remained now was the house. And its walls. Part 5. the house that remembers. Max's fingers clenched around the cold wood of the chair, his breath shallow as his chest burned with an unnatural ache. The house groaned around him, its walls shuddering, as if recognizing the shift in the air. The mirrors flickered with fractured reflections, distorting time, place, and space until he couldn't tell which version of himself was real. The voices that had whispered in his ears now filled the entire room. They no longer spoke in fragments but in full sentences, chanting, pleading, demanding. You must accept. You are the last. Take your place. Max struggled to keep his focus, to fight the overwhelming sensation that was crawling beneath his skin. His mind felt like it was unraveling, the edges of reality blurring as the room twisted around him. He could hear the sound of footsteps, a soft scraping of feet across the floor, but when he turned, the room remained empty. He was alone, but not really. The reflection in the chair, the older, broken version of himself, stared at him with vacant eyes, its mouth sealed shut by bloody stitches. It was him, but it wasn't. It was the final result of everything he had feared, the end of it. You don't have to do this, Max, the voice of his mother whispered, cutting through the cacophony. Her voice was soft, almost soothing. But beneath it, there was a coldness, a finality. You were always meant to inherit it, to keep it alive. Max felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He could hear the creaking of the floorboards as the house seemed to shift, pulling at the corners of the room like it was growing around him. I'm not them, Max said through gritted teeth, his eyes flashing with desperation. He was trembling now, his hand clenching tighter around the chair. The pain in his chest was unbearable, and for a moment, he thought it was his heart about to burst. You are. The reflection in the chair responded in a voice that didn't sound quite human. It was rough, guttural, like the sound of something not meant to speak. You always have been. All of you are the same. The bloodline. The curse. Max couldn't breathe. The walls pressed in on him, the darkness of the room swallowing him whole. He reached for the light, but there was no escape. There was no door. And then he felt it. A sensation that was both physical and mental. A cold hand brushing against his. A pull at the very core of his being, like the house was reaching into him. The coldness seeped deeper, into his bones, his heart, his thoughts. It felt as though it was wrapping around his very soul. You cannot leave. The voice of the woman, his mother, said again, this time louder, sharper, more commanding. You are already here. You belong here. The room shifted violently, and Max was thrown backward, landing hard on the floor. His vision blurred, but in the haze he could see the walls warping, the mirrors cracking and splitting, revealing images from his past. Faces, places, and scenes he couldn't fully recall, but they were familiar all the same. He saw his younger self, standing before the house in the distance, looking up at it. He saw his father, a strong, protective figure, standing in the doorway, urging him to stay away. But none of that mattered now. He saw the reflection of his mother. But it wasn't her face he saw. It was something else entirely. The walls groaned again, but now it wasn't just the house making the sound. It was something deeper, something within it. A voice, a low, primal growl, rumbled from the very heart of the house. It was an ancient sound, something that predated even the foundation of ray gun itself. Max's mind whirled with the sudden realization that the house wasn't merely haunted. It wasn't a cursed building that had claimed a family. No, this house was alive. It had always been alive. It was a parasite, a consuming thing that thrived on the souls of those bound to it. You were born here, his reflection whispered from the chair, its voice cold and distant. You can never leave. The house has you now. Max's pulse raced. his body trembling with the weight of it. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, suffocating him. But then, something deep inside him flickered. A defiance. A refusal. He wasn't going to be like them. The moment he thought it, the house recoiled. The walls seemed to shudder, as though repulsed by the very notion of defiance. Max pushed himself to his feet, his body shaking, but a spark of strength surged through him. He could feel it. There was something he could still do. With every ounce of energy left in his body, Max shouted into the suffocating air. "No! I will not stay here!" And then, he felt it. The pulse of the house shifted, its rhythm stuttered. The whispers faltered. The walls groaned as if in pain. And Max knew, in that moment, that he could still break free. The house had fed on fear, on blood, on the souls of his ancestors, but it had never expected this. The resistance. The refusal. The darkness in the room shrieked, as though something within it were burning. Max stumbled toward the chair, his hand reaching for the cold wood again, and he pulled at the chains that bound the broken figure. But as his fingers touched the cold metal, the air around him thickened, becoming almost liquid, suffocating him with its pressure. The shadows closed in, trying to pull him back. The reflection of his broken self in the chair was now fully awake, its eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't just terror, it was recognition. The figure was afraid. It was afraid because it knew what was coming. Max closed his eyes, focusing on his breath, willing the walls to recede. "You will never be free," the voice of his mother echoed. "You cannot escape your bloodline. You cannot escape me." And then, with every ounce of willpower he could muster, Max forced himself to stand tall, raising his arms as if reaching for the heavens themselves. "No!" he shouted. "I am not part of this. I will break the cycle." With that final cry, the house trembled violently, its very foundation groaning in agony. The air thickened, and for a moment, Max felt as though his mind would snap under the pressure. But then, the walls shattered. The darkness lifted, and the house broke. Max stumbled backward as the ground beneath him cracked open, sending plumes of dust into the air. The walls of the house groaned and cracked, splintering like an ancient tree struck by lightning. The mirrors shattered, their pieces falling like rain. And the whispers, the endless, insistent whispers, fell silent. Max stood alone in the ruins, gasping for breath. The house was no longer alive, and neither was he bound to it. But somewhere, deep in the shadows, he could feel the cold fingers of the past still trying to reach for him. The house had been defeated, but its story had not ended. The cycle had been broken, for now. As he turned to leave, Max knew one thing for certain. The house remembered, and it would never let him go. The end.